Welcome back to
Merendiando,
part of Radio Aluna Theater.
In today's episode, we chat with mother, human, playwright, and neurologist Suvendrini Lena.
Suvendrini works as a neurologist at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health and the Women's College Hospital. She has been an artist in residence at several artistic and medical organizations, including the Theatre Center and the University of Toronto.
Suvendrini is the writer of Rubble, a theater project currently in development at Aluna, inspired by the poetry of Palestinian writers Lena Khalaf Tuffaha and Mahmoud Darwish.
We chatted with Suvendrini about how her role as a doctor influenced her as a playwright and vice versa, and about what solidarity looks like in her work. Let's get started.
Welcome to the podcast.
Yay.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
You are many things, an artist, doctor, human being on this earth. And we are wondering, as a neurologist, as one of your many hats, what made you want to study the brain specifically?
Okay, well, maybe I'll answer that question backwards.
Yeah.
I don't think that if I had not had the opportunity to study the brain, I don't think I would have become a doctor. And what happened for me was, it's a very kind of common narrative among South Asians, and I'm the oldest daughter in my family. So I'll be quite frank. At about 28, I had a bit of a crisis. I had always wanted to be a writer, and it wasn't something that my family supported, let's put it like that. And so I caved and went to med school, which is what they really wanted me to do. And then in my second year of med school, and I was at UBC, we had a neuroanatomy lab where you get to see slices of the brain. So it's somebody's brain sliced up into these tiny, tiny sections, and you're looking at them under the microscope. And first of all, it's beautiful visually because they're all stained and there are different parts, and neurons look like branches, which is endlessly fascinating to me, just the idea of the branches.
Yeah.
But the other piece was that it really landed somehow that the kind of the materiality of consciousness, which is amazing.
Like by the materiality, do you mean like the physical?
Yes.
Ness of it?
Everything in a way. So this is kind of a philosophical statement, and people who are religious will disagree with me in a sense. And I'm a spiritual person in a certain way. I'm just not doctrinaire. But I believe that who we are lives in physical reality. Yeah. And I was able to see it. Right? And so for me, that was an epiphany that at that point I found that I could have a place in medicine, or I thought I could. And that if I was going to have a place in medicine, it would be in neurology, because that way I could learn about what this materiality of consciousness was really all about.
Wow. Talking about, you mentioned a little bit that you wanted to be a playwright when you were younger. What made you want to be a playwright then?
Well, actually, when I was younger, I wanted to write anything, whatever. I wanted to be a writer. I was one of those kids that wrote terrible poetry in the basement when I was like wanting to wanting to express. That was an element of my teenage rebellion. And I also, I remember writing this like long extended, very delusional novel about this person that just travels out into this empty wilderness. So I bought into the empty wilderness myth growing up in North America. And
You're innocent and young. It's okay.
The funny thing was, so it was like this huge big canoe trip down this crazy raging river into the middle of this forest, where then I met this person who was, in front of a fire, who was going to tell me what the meaning of life was. But that was the childhood novel. So I'm so glad that I don't know where it is. But so I'd always wanted to be a writer. I wanted to write anything. In university, I thought I would like to be a journalist because I was interested in politics and political movements, and I was an activist. And so I felt that was the natural expression of the urge to write. But none of those channels appealed to my parents, and I didn't have the courage to break their dreams, shatter their dreams, really.
Yeah. So then how did theater come about as a medium that like worked for you?
So it was a late discovery. I only discovered theater when I was in my residency. So after you do medical school, then you have to choose a specialty. I already knew I wanted to do neurology. So I applied to study neurology in Toronto. And of course, I was going through this residency. The Toronto program has a 1-year research project that you must finish in order to become a neurologist. And I said, I can't do a research project. It will kill me. I will die. What can I do instead? What story can I sell them that will allow me to do something else? Because at that point, the urge to write was just becoming overwhelming. And also, this was at the end of the Sri Lankan Civil War. So it was about 2008, 2009, going into 2009. And my mind was just in all kinds of pieces. So I asked them if I could do a creative writing project for my residency project instead of research. And through some miracle, they allowed me to do it. And that's how I wrote The Enchanted Loom, which is about a Sri Lankan political prisoner survivor who ends up with a head injury and epilepsy. And then it's a story about a family living in Toronto with the aftermath of that, right? But that was born out of the residency research project. Mm-hmm. That's how I discovered theater. And as a writer, it was tremendously liberating, because really in theater, you write dialogue or you describe actions, and you don't even describe action very much. Mm-hmm. That's mostly the domain of the actors and the directors, right? So you just hint at action and set some key details, and you're just in the world of what is spoken or maybe sometimes imagined. But it's in the form of what can be spoken. And that was really great for me, because when I had tried to write poetry or in the novel form, I just was bogged down entirely in the trees or the water or all these things that I was trying to fully encompass. And it didn't lead to good writing, I think. And so when I found theater, it was just so liberating, because you kind of can recreate a dialogue that may occur in your mind. And I was always one of those people that was having conversations with people in my head all the time. So there it was. And it was just, I finally found that I could write something that others could engage. Plus, theater is amazing in terms of how it's really created, because it's not an individual project. It is, the writer is not the same beast in theater as they are in anything else. I fully believe that. So I really think that most theater is collective creation now, especially. And the writer is sort of part of a process. And I love that. I love the fact that the work is reworked and vetted and benefits from the experience of others from beginning to end.
And how has working in theater and all these creative practices influenced you as a physician?
So if you can think of it this way, every time you talk to somebody as a physician, you're kind of establishing their character, their setting, and a bit of a plot.
It's true.
Yeah.
Right? So you're in a script already. So actually, most medical encounters have that structure for me. So I see them as very much, I think that the skills that I have as a writer of theater help me in medicine. And I think that my experience in medicine obviously informs the writing, although it's not always complementary. I would say in the last 3 years during the pandemic, my writing has really shut down, except for some journalistic writing. And that's because medicine has overwhelmed creative space for me.
Yeah. We read, I think it was like a long article that you wrote about your experience in the pandemic, and it was beautiful. I cried reading it. Oh. Yeah, it's just so interesting. The writer's urge, it sounds like you just can't escape it. So you might as well give it space in your life and use those different forces in your life to inform your writing. So I'm just wondering, for you personally, what do you do when you do you remember feeling inspired and flowy as a writer? Because I know you just said the last 3 years have not really been much of that, but what has your writing practice looked like? Or when you feel a story or you feel that flow?
Yeah, I guess it's like, I'm a writer that needs structure. So I do actually do best in, at some point, entering into a writer's residency,
like a circle or
something like that. Yeah. which theater kind of gives you anyway. Once you have a draft of something, you have workshops and actors and these beautiful people that are thinking so deeply about every single word. So that I think is essential. But the inspiration, it's usually, I don't know, I think most people will say this, there'll be an idea that pursues you somehow. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's somehow you can't, or some, because it's theater for me, sometimes it's a visual. So in the case of the Enchanted Loom, it was the surgery, the neurosurgery scene that was the starting moment where, you know, I'd had an experience in med school where, and this is common, so awake craniotomies, where if you're trying to resect a tumor, you're trying to preserve brain that people need. And so they can sometimes be conscious during the surgery so that you can really make the boundaries of the incision as precise as possible and not sacrifice things that cannot be sacrificed. So that was the visual that was the seed for the Enchanted Loom. And with Rubble, there were two things. One was reading Lena's poem, Running Orders, which partly because I have a son who plays soccer. And so I had this very vivid personal experience of sitting in that, watching that game where Messi misses his penalty. And what a kind of core experience that was for so many families and so many young kids. And to have that happen at the moment that your house is being targeted, I felt it was such a relatable experience for me. And it would be such a relatable experience for so many. And I think that's why that poem went viral in the way that it did. I think it was partly the idea that David is calling and telling you that your house is targeted and you have 58 seconds literally to get out. And the second piece, that it happens in this moment that is so relatable and just so that should be like it's such a normal rite of passage for kids to go through these things and be invested in that game. And their hero lets them down, but it's okay because mom's made dinner, right?
Yeah, there's like basic other things that are fine. Like that is the crisis, not everything else. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah. Right. So that's what I think that was reading that poem. That poem would not let me alone, and I could see it. So when you see it, I think if you're a writer, then you want to make it, right? So Lena gave me that, right? And then I contacted Lena and asked for permission to try to write it, and she agreed. And the other thing that of course led to Rubble was having traveled to Gaza twice as a physician prior to that. Mm-hmm. And so it was the actual memory of the rubble. So every time I see, every single year they bomb Gaza one way or another. Mm-hmm. And so you see these reiterations of this of broken concrete and kids looking at the wreckage of their homes. Mm-hmm. That's the image. But for me, that's an image that I've seen and been inside. So that's another one that doesn't leave.
Yeah. Well, for folks who aren't familiar with Rubble as a project, we just want to describe it a little bit for people who are listening. So, using the theater, a community is created between actors and audience, and the voice of the poet Mahmoud Darwish, the late Palestinian national poet. And this piece examines the old question of the meaning of poetry in the midst of war and the responsibility of those of us who read, hear, or witness their words. It's currently in development with Aluna, so we're very excited to. That's part of the reason why Suvendrini is here today, to tell us a bit more about the project. It's in development with Aluna and Theatre Passe Muraille, with additional support from Pandemic Theatre and Nightwood Theatre.
The play is based around the poetry of, like how you, Camila just mentioned, Mahmoud Darwish. And when did you first encounter his poetry?
I don't know.
Fair.
I think that I first discovered him in Egypt when I was in my second year of undergrad. I was studying history and I went to Cairo for, like a student exchange. And I studied at the American University in Cairo. I fell in love. The person I fell in love with was an Egyptian activist, and he was very much a fan of Mahmoud Darwish. So I have these memories of hearing that poetry. And I think that is where I discovered Darwish. So it was an old lover. The poetry is so romantic. So I think that for me, one of the resonances of that poetry is it's so much of it is about love and absence.
Yeah. It's so interesting. This project like approaches poetry and war and tries to understand, like we said, what is the meaning of them? What do they have to inform each other? And there's something about that there's like war in my head is just so chaotic and cruel. And for me, there's something about the brain, as someone who has not studied it, that also feels chaotic. But then poetry kind of makes some sort of sense. And I wonder what you think about that. Like, why did you want to talk about poetry and war, I guess? What do they have to do with each other for you?
Yeah, I've thought about this a lot too. This isn't a complete answer.
Yeah.
One thing, so the tradition of poetry in the Arab world as well as in the Tamil culture is there's a tradition of oral poetry, right? And of poets having people gather around them and they read their work out loud, so you hear it. Mm-hmm. And it's a very active, participatory listening with nothing distracting you from the words, right? So it's just the words and your imagination, and there's a collective act of imagining going on around these words. So what I think is that in that tradition, and when we think of poetry in that way, it puts you in the present moment. What Darwish wrote about in The State of Siege, and in his other book, I think it's called Memory of Forgetting, but he wrote it in Beirut under siege in 1982. There's a lot of description of present acts. There's a lot of preoccupation with how the past and the future impinge upon the present, but there's also a lot of poetry that deals with drinking a coffee or making a coffee, or the taste of coffee, or the color of the sky as you watch it in the present moment. You see that in The State of Siege a lot, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that in war as well, one of the ways that people cope with it is to really be in the present, right? The moment-to-moment survival and the moment-to-moment relationships, what's in front of you, because there really isn't anything else that you can control. There's very little you can control, but people who experience it and who write about it. And when I was in Gaza in 2002, there were raids at night, and I was staying with a family. They were always up at night, and they were cooking and talking together, and the present was just incredibly full within this. So I felt like that was something that they had cultivated to survive, but it was also a tremendous sign of their strength and their resilience, but it was also narcotic almost, right? It allows you to grab onto life and keep going. So I think it's that. I think that that poetry, more than any other form, has this groundedness in the present. If it's that experience of listening, you're in the word in a collective setting, and that's, I think, why those things in my mind came together.
And how does the story of Rubble relate to your work as a neurologist?
Does it?
Does it? It doesn't at all.
Yeah. You said you went to Gaza as with Doctors Without Borders, is that right?
No. I went with, the first time I went, I was also in university, and I actually went, U of T had this program where you could go study at the Hebrew University, which is in the West Bank, in Mount Scopus. So I went there, did that course, and then I, knew that there was more to be learned about the situation. So I, through, meeting people on the street and various other things, I met a woman also named Tanya, who was South Asian, it's crazy because my first name is Tanya. I met this woman named Tanya who had been working with an NGO in Gaza, and she connected me up with a family there, in fact, who worked in the museum that existed there at the time. And that's how I first went to Gaza. And on my way back, I was sharing a taxi with a father and a son. The son was traveling to Jerusalem for a medical procedure, and he had been shot, this kid, at age 10. So we stopped every hour and a half, every 2 hours, for him to go to the toilet because he had no control over his bowel and bladder. So this was another one of those images that has meant for me that this connection that I made with Gaza was not something I wanted to let go of, and I needed to process it. Coming from Sri Lanka, I'm half Tamil and half Sinhalese, but I really grew up with my Tamil family, and this is my sensibilities unabashedly on this side. But I could see the relationship in the experiences, and that's part of it. But also, that has always been something that I always think of that father and that son So for you to know, these are how I think things stay with you. The second time, though, I went back, it was with the Palestine Solidarity Organization in Vancouver, where I was studying medicine. And that was the time that Rachel, I can't remember her last name now, there was an American woman who was bulldozed by the Israelis. Oh. There's now a big foundation, Solidarity Foundation, that pays homage to her. She, tried to stop a bulldozer from destroying a house, and they just went right over her and she died. So it was at that time that those things were happening, and it was with a Palestine Solidarity Organization that was really Palestinian. So that's how and then in that setting, I actually went and worked in a bunch of hospitals and learned a tremendous amount from the Palestinian physicians, who were incredible.
So I can see it's like there is a medical connection in that. It's one of the things that brought you there, but there's so many human stories that are just beyond like your role, just as someone who's witnessing people.
Yeah. Once you become a doctor, then that's the most useful thing you can do in most places. Even here, it continues to be probably the most useful thing I can do, although I don't think it's the most important thing I do. I think when I'm in my role as a mother is more important, and my role as an artist is more important to me. I think that the transformative impulse in society comes from the arts, and we cannot continue in this manner. And if changes to occur, artists' voices are going to lead that, right?
We've seen there's a running theme in the way that you talk about your work, and it seems important for you to remind people that like physicians are human beings too. Like you are a mother, an artist, and a physician, but you're also not perfect. You don't have all the answers. And there's like a human toll to medicine for not just the patient, but also the physician. I guess like, why is it important for you to humanize medical professionals? I mean, that's kind of a strange question. I think they are humans, but it's just, it seems like something you're very passionate about. So I'm just wondering where that comes from.
I think part of it is that, there's a lot of criticisms of medicine and of physicians and their roles and their power, right, within the system that we live in. And you can see that from the pandemic. There was a very, physicians and public health authorities had unquestioned power. They also had tremendous responsibility and are horrifically burnt out. And they accepted all of that, both the power and the burnout. So what I'm trying to do by making people conscious of the personal costs for them of these choices is to shift to a model where responsibility is more shared, both with the patient and with other kinds of healers in society, where we pay attention to the social determinants of health, and we don't think there's a pill for hypertension that's going to solve somebody working for 80 hours a week for 20 years, and that's why they have high blood pressure, right? So if you realize that you have limitations, whether they be emotional or physical, then you realize that you can't solve these bigger problems alone. You don't have that power. You don't necessarily want that power. Maybe that power is something that needs to be held collectively. Physicians need to give up power, and they might realize that by seeing the costs that they are inflicting upon themselves. And that will leave space for others to bring other forms of healing and for us to address structural problems that cause illness, disease, suffering. Okay, I'll ask you guys a question. So there was one question that I think needs to be addressed, and I liked very much. The one about, I don't know how you phrased it, but it was about me not being Palestinian.
Yes. This is a question I have just because, maybe I'll ask it.
I think it needs to be asked. And I think when these questions are not asked, we do ourselves a disservice, right?
Yeah. So just back to Rubble for a moment. Yeah. Just about humans and being, not having all the power. And that is a really wonderful thought to chew on. Power dynamics are all over also the project, the Israeli project. And in Rubble, you are really dealing with that face on. And we have a question about solidarity, because from what I've also seen of the project of Rubble, there's so many ways that like solidarity between different cultures and people is trying to be embodied and trying to be questioned and provoked. So because this story is about Palestine and about a Palestinian family and people, You yourself, have said you're not Palestinian, but you've chosen to create this piece. So how have you approached writing this piece as someone who is not Palestinian? How does solidarity between people play a role in the development of this piece for you?
Yeah, it's a really difficult question because there's so many different levels on which one wants to answer it.
Yeah.
So there's the simple level of voice and whose voice should be telling this story, right? So I do think, this may be controversial, but I do think in theater, because of the collective creation process, we have the capacity to accommodate some of those conversations better, right? Because I'm not writing this as a novel that I'm putting forward about Palestinians or about Gaza, right? What it is if it's cast properly and directed properly, then everything that's said and done is mediated by a cast that are either Palestinian, ideally, or in deep solidarity through having done work with the Palestinian experience, right? And that will stretch the piece and interrogate it and make it and see whether it's up to the task. So that's one of the reasons why I like theater, because you can offer something up, and if you do it sort of honestly, without try to pull your ego away from it, and give space to other artists to really ask their questions and to really say, well, there's a problem with this. This is good, I relate to it. Even if they don't relate to it, is it important? You can still have that question and that conversation, right? Because even among Palestinians, there are many different experiences. People who have lived in the diaspora, people who have moved from Palestine, people who have lived in Gaza, people who have varying degrees of language fluency and cultural loss, right, from this process of being removed from Palestine and excluded from Palestine, really, I should say. So I think that theater gives us some tools that are not available to other forms in the same way, which is one of the beautiful things about it. I think working with Aluna in particular gives us those tools because the perspective is always around decolonization and always about interrogating freedom, and whether we're serving freedom and justice through our work. And so when you have a collective that can do the work that way, and a director, and we have an assistant director on this project as well with Rima, who can bring that perspective, then I think you can move ahead still cautiously, right? But you can do it. And I personally think that cross cultural solidarity between communities of color is absolutely essential to build the kind of world that we want in any of the areas where we're struggling at the moment. So I see this work as an example of that as well. The other thing I wanted to say about it is this question of authorship and what is authorship. So I also think, and this is my view, that, sometimes the author is more of a vessel than a originator. For me, in my own writing process, I really feel like I almost always am standing on the shoulders and just drinking from the fountains of other writers that have come before me, their words, their metaphors, their stories. And yes, we need to be conscious of that, but I think we need to just constantly acknowledge it. That's my understanding of language and how it works. So I think that all writers do this, but all of us have different perspectives on it. My perspective is really that, so when I was working on this, I asked Lena if I could animate her poem, and if I could use it as a seed to create characters and build a story around them. So she had put these characters. There was a family that she described, a son, a daughter, and a mom, right?
And just for listeners at home, I want to say Lena is the author of the Running Orders poem that we talked about earlier. Is that right?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Keep going.
She's a brilliant Palestinian poet. So I asked her for permission to do that. And then I actually sent her drafts periodically and said, could you read this and tell me whether you like this or you don't like it, or what is your thought? And so I tried to get feedback from an early point. The other thing was that I knew that the state of siege, the words of the state of siege, Darwish's poem, were resonating and, playing themselves around in my head as I created this. And so I asked Fadi Judah, who's also a physician and he's a poet and a translator, whether we could use his translations and whether he would potentially participate in the process. So the workshopping process through which the script was built also involved conversations with them. Mm-hmm. And we've talked about how, when we do it, we'll need to publish Fadi's poetry, the translations, as well as Lena's, so that the audience is aware of the sources. Mm-hmm. This is very important to me. It's very important to me that that the audience leave with that as well. And they understand that there's a lineage of writers here that are in dialogue with one another, but these are their words, and they'll know what are mine, right? And mine are, of course, mediated by what the actors and director have offered throughout the process. So I think it's about authorship too. So what do you really think the author is? This relates to this question of who can voice something. I also think that when voices are actively suppressed, the way Palestinian voices are actively suppressed, with book bannings and burnings and picketing of their theater and like all kinds of excessive
methods.
Yes. Then I think that it's our duty to also add to turn the volume up. I may have more ability to initiate a conversation that can then be amplified, taken over. Ideally, it can provide a platform for bigger conversation. Ideally, we can contextualize this play with historical information, contemporary exhibits of some sort, whether online or in the theater itself, that relate to what's happening in Gaza now, so that it's actually is making space for other voices. That's ideal, right? So that's what I think in my role as a non-Palestinian writer is to continually make myself make those spaces and know when to step back as well.
It's beautiful to witness like this level of solidarity and clarity around it, because I feel like there's just a lot of attempts in a lot of art projects to collaborate with other people, but the question of authorship is so good. Like, what does it really mean to the people in the room, and how are we sharing that role in a way?
And I think, though, to be honest, it's easier for me to problematize authorship because because being a writer is not my only identity.
Mm-hmm. You can have some space a little, in a way.
I have another very firm, societally approved, respected identity. So it's fine for me to go around problematizing what it is to be a writer and an author.
Right. Because you don't have to take it as personally as someone who's trying to make their rent.
And so that's the other thing, right? To be conscious of that. So there's reasons why people assume different positions around this conversation, which all have to do with power.
Right. Yeah, totally.
Talking about conversations in theater, every episode we ask our current guests to post a question to the next guest so we can keep the conversation going across practice and across borders. And our previous guest, Sohail Parsa, an amazing director, asked you this question. Mm-hmm. If you are a theater artist, why have you chosen theater? Why not film? What makes this art form so unique to you or for you?
I think in some ways I've answered this question because I've explained that the collective creation process in theater is so unique. It's so, I'm a great admirer of Augusto Boal. I apologize if I mispronounced. And the idea that, as we embody characters, when we do that, we can change narratives, and these are narratives of our lives, right? And that this can serve all kinds of transformation. So to me, that's the essence of theater, is that. So for me, like, to create a piece, I'm creating a piece that I think is trying to imagine something different, or I'm trying to tear something I don't like apart most often, right? And so it's active and it's collective and it's imaginative. The collective part to me is key. Like, there is a relationship between an author and a reader, of course, right? We don't do the poetry live reading dynamic the way other cultures still do here in even in Toronto, but there's like a spoken word community that does, right? So they keep that flame alive. And that would be another similar form. But I'm not enough of a poet to be able to do that. And I'm not enough of a musician to be able to do that. So the theater suits me just fine.
Excellent. Yeah. Suvendrini, if you could ask a question to our next guest, who in fact we know, their name, I don't know if you know them, Victoria Mata, who's developing a piece about cacao in Venezuela in Aluna's season. What would you ask them?
Okay, can I just free associate a little bit?
Yeah.
Okay, so when I think of cacao, what I'm really thinking about, it gives me a sensory experience. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering about how we translate that into the theatrical space. Like the smell and the sounds. And I know we do things with sound and light, but the tactile pieces and the smell of things, like how do we make theater so really embodied for audiences? I'm really interested in that. And smell and cacao, that really lined up for me with that.
Yeah. That's a beautiful question.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, great. Well, we're going to ask it to her.
Excited to ask it.
Great. Okay.
Yeah. We'll ask her in the next episode. So if you're curious about the answer, you can pop it on your headphones in about a month.
Amazing. I'm looking forward to seeing what you guys do with this. Thank you. It was so much fun talking to you both.
We are speaking to you from the shores of this beautiful Zaga Igan, known to some as Lake Ontario, in Toronto, or Dougarondo. This is the ancestral territory of the Haudenosaunee or Longhouse Confederacy, the Anishinaabe Nation, the Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. This land is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum and Treaty 13, also known as the Toronto Purchase.
At Aluna, we remember that people can begin to heal when they are hurt. We are committed to artful participation in disagreements. We are committed to unsettling ourselves towards connection, respect, and justice for all people who now live in this city, which has been a meeting place since time immemorial.
Radio Aluna Teatro is produced by Aluna Theatre with support from the Toronto Arts Council, the Ontario Arts Council, the Canada Council for the Arts, the Department of Canadian Heritage, and TD Bank.
Aluna Theatre is Beatriz Pisano and Trevor Shelness. Radio Aluna Theatre is produced by Mónica Garrido and Camila Diaz Varela. For more about Aluna Theatre, visit us at alunatheatre.ca, follow at Aluna Theatre on Twitter or Instagram, or like us on Facebook.
Miigwech and Nyawangoa.